In the unforgiving wilderness of Montana's Gallatin County, Gracie, a severely traumatized and critically injured young bobcat, was found alone by the side of a remote road. Exhausted, terrified, and barely clinging to life. Many believed she couldn't be saved and recommended humane euthanasia. But one determined wildlife veterinarian refused to give up on her. At first, Gracie was too frightened to eat and pressed herself into the farthest corner of her enclosure, her eyes locked in constant fear. But then, when the vet chose a path fraught with risk, defying standard protocols, Gracie took her first bite of food and began the long journey toward healing. Bit by bit, she grew braver, began exploring her space, and started showing signs of trust, not just in her environment, but in the man who never left her side. What begins as an act of desperate compassion evolves into something professionals can't explain. What desperate measure did this seasoned vet take? Why does this wild predator respond to Tom when she rejects all others? Inspired by true events at the Bridger Mountain Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, this is a story of boundaries crossed and bonds formed, and of how sometimes, in saving another, we discover parts of ourselves we never knew were lost. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The Montana winter had been unforgiving that year. Dr. Thomas Adler tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his truck navigated the winding back roads of Gallatin County, the wipers barely keeping pace with the light snowfall. At 45, he had spent the better part of 2 decades as a wildlife veterinarian at the Bridger Mountain Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. But something about this particular call felt different. Just off Miller Creek Road, Jenny, his assistant, had said over the phone an hour earlier. "A hiker found her. Says she's in bad shape, Doc." The Bridger Mountain Wildlife Rehabilitation Center wasn't large. Just Tom, Jenny, and 3 part-time volunteers. But over the years, they had developed a reputation throughout Montana for their work with injured wildlife. Tom had dedicated his life to the center after leaving a lucrative small animal practice in Bozeman. The money had been good, but the endless parade of routine vaccinations and nail trims had left him feeling hollow. Out here, working with wild animals that truly needed him, he found purpose. It was mid-afternoon when he spotted the flashing hazards of the hiker's vehicle. A man in a heavy parka waved him down, his breath visible in the cold air. "Over there." The hiker, who introduced himself as Mike, pointed toward a shallow ditch about 20 feet from the roadside. "I was taking photos of tracks in the new snow and almost missed her. Thought she was dead at first." Tom grabbed his kit from the truck bed and approached cautiously. What he saw made his chest tighten. A young female bobcat, not fully grown, likely under 2 years old, lay curled into herself. Her tawny fur was matted with blood and dirt, one hind leg clearly broken. Her side rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. As a wildlife veterinarian, Tom had seen plenty of injured animals before. Deer struck by cars, eagles with gunshot wounds, bears caught in illegal traps. But there was something about the vulnerability of this bobcat that struck him deeply. She was just conscious enough to register his presence, her golden eyes flickering open for a moment, filled with terror but too weak to run or fight. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though he knew the words meant nothing to her. In her eyes, he was just another predator approaching when she couldn't defend herself. The initial assessment wasn't promising. In addition to the broken leg, she showed signs of severe dehydration, possible internal bleeding, and what looked like an infected wound on her shoulder. perhaps from a fight with another predator or a run-in with barbed wire. Most concerning was her diminished response to stimuli. She was hovering at the edge of consciousness. "Is she going to make it?" Mike asked, keeping his distance. Tom didn't answer immediately. The compassionate thing, many would argue, would be euthanasia. She was suffering, and her prognosis was guarded at best. Even if she survived, rehabilitation would be lengthy, challenging, and might still end in failure. Wild animals didn't always recover well from such traumatic injuries, physically or psychologically. "I'm going to try," he finally said, more to himself than to Mike. With gentle, practiced movements, Tom sedated her with a low dose of ketamine from his emergency kit, just enough to prevent her from experiencing additional stress during transport. He covered her with a thermal blanket and carefully placed her in a carrier. "Thanks for finding her," he told Mike. "You probably saved her life." Mike nodded, though his expression betrayed doubt about whether that life would continue much longer. As Tom drove back to the center, his mind raced through treatment protocols, calculating drug dosages, and planning the sequence of diagnostics. But beneath these professional thoughts ran a deeper current of emotion he couldn't quite name. Something about this Bobcat, her youth, her vulnerability, the slight flicker of defiance still visible even in her weakened state, had gotten under his skin. "I don't know your story, little one," he said to the carrier beside him, "but I promise I'll do my best." The rehab center was quiet when he arrived. Jenny had gone home for the day, and the volunteers weren't scheduled until tomorrow. It was just him and the facility's current residents. 2 red-tailed hawks recovering from wing injuries, a young black bear cub that would overwinter with them before spring release, and an elderly coyote that had become a permanent resident after being orphaned and hand-raised by someone who kept her as an illegal pet for years. Tom carried the carrier into the examination room and began setting up for triage. The Bobcat hadn't moved during the drive, but her breathing seemed marginally stronger, a small victory he'd take for now. "Let's get you stable first," he said, preparing IV fluids. "Then we'll figure out the rest." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of focused intensity. X-rays confirmed a clean break in her right hind leg and revealed 2 cracked ribs. Blood work showed severe anemia and elevated white blood cell count. The wound on her shoulder was indeed infected, and her temperature was dangerously low. Tom inserted an IV catheter, started antibiotics, administered pain medication, and cleaned her wounds. The leg would need surgery, but that would have to wait until she was more stable. Midnight had come and gone by the time Tom stepped back from the treatment table, his scrub stained, his back aching. He had done everything medically possible for the moment. Now it was up to her. He transferred her to a small, quiet recovery kennel in the back room, away from the other animals. He equipped it with warming pads and set up monitoring equipment to alert him if her condition changed overnight. As he watched her breathing, more regular now but still labored, he realized he hadn't even given her a name yet. They tried not to name wildlife that would eventually be released, but something told him this one would be with them for a while. "Gracie," he said suddenly, the name coming to him from somewhere deep in his memory. Perhaps it was his grandmother's middle name, or a character from a book he'd once loved. He couldn't place it, but it fit. "Your name is Gracie." In the dim light of the recovery room, Tom pulled up a chair beside her kennel. The sensible thing would be to go upstairs to the small apartment he kept above the center, set an alarm to check on her hourly, and get some rest. Instead, he found himself settling in for the night, unwilling to leave her alone. "Fight, Gracie," he whispered. "Just keep fighting." The next 3 days were critical. Jenny arrived early the following morning to find Tom asleep in the chair beside Gracie's kennel, his notebook of medication schedules and vitals still open on his lap. "Tom," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you should get some real rest." He jerked awake, immediately checking the monitors. "She made it through the night," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. "Her temp's up and her heartbeat is steadier." Jenny looked at the motionless Bobcat. "She's young. That's in her favor." "We need to get her eating soon," Tom said, rubbing his face. "And that leg needs surgery today if she's stable enough." Jenny had worked with Tom long enough to recognize when he became particularly invested in a patient. It didn't happen often, but when it did, she knew better than to suggest he step back or maintain professional distance. Some animals just got to him in ways others didn't. "I'll prep the surgical suite," she said instead. "You go shower and change. I'll monitor her." By afternoon, Gracie had undergone surgery to set her broken leg with a series of pins. The procedure had gone well, but she still hadn't eaten and remained almost catatonic with fear when conscious. Even heavily sedated, her body remained rigid, as if permanently braced for attack. A week passed, then another. Physically, Gracie was improving incrementally. The infection responded to antibiotics. Her ribs were healing. The surgical site looked clean. But her psychological state was deteriorating. She retreated to the farthest corner of her kennel, pressing herself against the wall when anyone approached. She wouldn't eat if people were present, forcing them to leave food and return later to find it untouched or barely nibbled. When necessary treatments required handling, she would go rigid with terror, her heart rate spiking dangerously. "This isn't working," Jenny said on day 16, watching Gracie through the observation window. "She's starving herself. If she doesn't start eating properly soon, we'll lose her." Tom nodded grimly. "I know." He had seen it before. Wild animals so traumatized they essentially gave up. The will to live was as important as any medical treatment. "Have you considered?" Jenny hesitated. "No," Tom said firmly, knowing she was suggesting euthanasia. "Not yet. I want to try something else first." That night, after Jenny and the volunteers had gone home, Tom sat in his office staring at Gracie's file. Her weight had dropped again. At this rate, they'd need to force-feed her soon, which would only increase her stress. They were running out of options. He thought about the wildlife rehabilitation conferences he'd attended, the papers he'd read, the colleagues he'd consulted. Modern wildlife medicine had advanced significantly in recent years, but some challenges remained as old as the practice itself. How to help a wild animal heal without destroying its essential wildness. How to support without creating dependence. How to gain trust without domestication. The idea came to him not from any scientific paper, but from a memory. Years ago, he'd worked briefly with a horse whisperer who rehabilitated abused horses. The man would simply sit in the corral reading a book, ignoring the traumatized horse completely. Days would pass like this until eventually, curiosity overcame fear, and the horse would approach on its own terms. "It's about choice," the man had explained. "You can't force trust. You can only create the conditions where trust becomes possible." Tom glanced at his watch, nearly midnight, then stood up decisively. He grabbed his dinner from the refrigerator, a sandwich he hadn't had time to eat earlier, and walked to Gracie's enclosure. The recovery kennel was larger than standard, designed for medium-sized mammals, with solid walls on 3 sides and a reinforced glass front for observation. Inside was a hiding box, water dish, and various platforms for climbing. Though Gracie had used none of these, remaining huddled in her corner. Tom took a deep breath, then did something that went against all standard protocols for handling dangerous wildlife. He entered her enclosure. Gracie's eyes widened, her pupils dilating in terror. A low, warning growl emerged from her throat, the first sound he'd heard her make since her arrival. Tom didn't look at her directly. Instead, he sat down on the floor near the door, as far from her corner as the space allowed, and unwrapped his sandwich. He took a bite and chewed slowly, keeping his movements minimal, his posture relaxed. "Just having dinner, Gracie," he said softly. "Don't mind me." For 20 minutes, he sat there eating his sandwich and occasionally sipping from a water bottle. Gracie remained frozen in her corner, eyes fixed on him, muscles tensed for flight or fight. Tom pretended not to notice, though he was acutely aware of every small movement she made. When he finished eating, he simply sat quietly for another 10 minutes, then gathered his trash, stood very slowly, and left the enclosure, careful not to make sudden movements or look back at her. Outside, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was a risky approach, one Jenny would likely disapprove of. A cornered bobcat, even a weakened juvenile, could inflict serious damage. But something told him this was the right path forward. "See you tomorrow, Gracie," he said through the glass. The next evening, he came again with his dinner. This time, he brought a book as well. Gracie's reaction was the same: rigid terror, warning growls, but perhaps slightly less intense. Again, he ate quietly, read a few pages, and left after 30 minutes. On the third night, he brought a small portion of the special diet they'd prepared for her, raw ground rabbit meat mixed with vital nutrients, and placed it halfway between himself and her corner before sitting down with his own meal. "Thought you might like some company for dinner," he said casually. For 5 nights, the ritual continued. Tom would enter with food for both of them, sit quietly, eat his meal, sometimes read or speak softly about inconsequential things: the weather, the other animals at the center, the latest wildlife research he'd been reading. Gracie remained in her corner, but her posture gradually began to change. The growling stopped. Sometimes she would lower her head slightly, her eyes tracking his movements with wariness but less panic. On the 6th night, something remarkable happened. As Tom sat reading, pretending to be absorbed in his book, Gracie shifted slightly. Almost imperceptibly, she moved a few inches from her corner, then a few more. By the time Tom prepared to leave, she had crossed nearly a third of the distance between them and had sniffed at the food he'd left, though she hadn't yet eaten it. "That's it," Tom whispered after exiting the enclosure. Baby steps. The breakthrough came on the 10th night. Tom had been sitting for about 20 minutes when, from the corner of his eye, he saw Gracie cautiously approach the food dish he'd placed on the floor. She sniffed it thoroughly, then took a small bite, her eyes never leaving him. Then another bite, then another. She was eating, truly eating, for the first time since her arrival. Tom kept his celebration internal, maintaining his calm exterior, but inside he was jubilant. He continued reading as if nothing extraordinary was happening, though he couldn't help the slight smile that formed on his face. When Jenny arrived the next morning, Tom was waiting with the news. She ate almost the entire portion. Jenny checked the monitoring system, confirming what Tom had reported. "That's fantastic, but..." She hesitated. "Tom, you've been going into her enclosure, alone, at night?" "It's working," he said simply. "It's dangerous," she countered. "She's wild, injured, and traumatized. That's a recipe for disaster." She needs to learn to trust again, Tom insisted. Not just for her psychological well-being, but for her physical recovery too. The stress was killing her as surely as her injuries would have. Jenny sighed, knowing that arguing was pointless. Just be careful. I don't want to have to explain to the board why our senior veterinarian has bobcat lacerations. Tom smiled. Noted. Over the following weeks, a remarkable transformation took place. Gracie began eating regularly, first only when Tom was present, then eventually accepting food from Jenny as well. Her physical recovery accelerated once proper nutrition was established. The pins in her leg were doing their job, and her mobility improved daily. But it was the psychological changes that were most striking. Gracie started using the platforms in her enclosure, showing interest in enrichment toys, and even playfully pouncing on the occasional leaf that blew in when the door was opened. Her eyes, once dull with fear and pain, now held the alert, intelligent gaze characteristic of her species. Tom continued his evening visits, though the nature of them evolved. No longer was it about coaxing her to eat or merely tolerating human presence. Now it seemed to be about connection, a strange, unlikely bridge forming between human and wild animal. "You're looking strong today," Tom commented one evening in early spring, nearly 4 months after Gracie's rescue. He sat on the floor of her now larger rehabilitation enclosure, making notes about her progress while she explored nearby, occasionally glancing in his direction. The leg had healed well, though she would always have a slight limp. Her coat had regained its luster, the distinctive spots and stripes of the bobcat now clear against the tawny background. She was still underweight, but gaining steadily. By all medical measures, Gracie was approaching readiness for the final phase of rehabilitation before potential release. She should have been moved to the outdoor pre-release enclosure weeks ago to begin the process of reacclimating to natural conditions and reducing human contact. Yet Tom had delayed, finding reasons to extend her indoor recovery. "We're getting too attached," Jenny noted one afternoon as they observed Gracie through the window. She was batting at a hanging toy, her movements becoming more fluid and graceful each day. "Both of us, but especially you." Tom didn't deny it. "She's special." "They're all special," Jenny reminded him gently. "But they're not pets. They're wild animals that need to return to their natural habitat when possible." "I know," Tom sighed. "I'll prepare the outdoor enclosure tomorrow." That night, as if sensing the impending change, Gracie seemed particularly interactive. When Tom entered with his customary book and snack, she approached closer than ever before, sniffing curiously at his boots. He remained still, hardly daring to breathe as she investigated, coming within inches of his hand where it rested on his knee. "Hey there," he whispered. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought she might allow him to touch her, something he had never attempted, respecting the boundaries necessary for her eventual return to the wild. Instead, she moved away, but not back to her corner. She settled on a platform about 3 feet away, curled up, and began grooming herself as if his presence was now so normal it required no special attention. It was, in its way, more meaningful than if she had permitted contact. This wasn't about becoming tame, but about reaching an understanding across the divide of species. Mutual respect rather than dominance or submission. The outdoor enclosure was ready by the end of the week. It was a spacious, naturalistic habitat with native plants, rocks for climbing, logs for scratching, and a small artificial den. It was designed to minimize human contact while allowing observation from concealed points. Moving day was difficult. Gracie had to be sedated for transport, and when she awoke in the new environment, Her initial reaction was fear. Tom watched from the observation blind as she frantically searched the unfamiliar space, vocalizing distress calls he'd never heard her make before. "She'll adjust," Jenny assured him. "They always do." But Gracie didn't adjust as expected. While she explored her new environment and utilized its features, she showed signs of distress whenever too many days passed without seeing Tom. She would pace, vocalize, and sometimes refuse food. The progress they'd made seemed to be eroding. After 2 weeks of concerning behavior, Jenny finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Tom, I think we need to consider that Gracie might not be a candidate for release." Tom had been thinking the same thing, but had been reluctant to voice it. In wildlife rehabilitation, release back to the wild was always the goal. Anything less was considered a kind of failure. "Her leg has healed as well as can be expected, but that limp will make hunting difficult," Jenny continued. "And then there's the behavioral component. She's imprinted on you in a way. Not fully, but enough that she's struggling with the transition." "So what are you suggesting?" Tom asked, though he already knew. "Either transfer to a wildlife sanctuary or—" Jenny hesitated, knowing how rarely Tom approved this option. "Permanent residence here as an education animal." Education animals were wildlife that couldn't be released but could serve as ambassadors for their species, helping to teach the public about conservation. It was a fate reserved for animals that could adapt to captivity without suffering and would otherwise face euthanasia. "Let me think about it," Tom said. That night, he visited Gracie in her outdoor enclosure, entering through the keeper door after hours. It was against protocol once an animal had begun pre-release conditioning, but he needed to see her, to assess for himself what the right path forward might be. She appeared almost immediately, emerging from the artificial den with more animation than he'd seen from her in weeks. She approached cautiously but purposefully, stopping a few feet away. "Hey, Gracie," he said softly. "I hear you've been having a rough time." In the fading light of dusk, man and Bobcat regarded each other. Tom saw intelligence in her eyes, and something else. Recognition, perhaps even trust. But he also saw wildness there. The essential nature of a predator evolved for solitary survival in difficult terrain. It wasn't a simple decision. Keeping her in captivity, even in the best possible conditions, would deny her the fullness of her natural existence. Yet releasing her with reduced hunting ability and unusual comfort around humans could be a death sentence. As if sensing his dilemma, Gracie did something unprecedented. She moved closer, circled once, then settled on the ground near his feet, not touching him, but closer than she had ever voluntarily positioned herself before. She yawned, showing impressive canines, then began grooming, completely at ease in his presence. The message seemed clear enough. 6 months later, Tom stood before the newly completed habitat at the eastern edge of the rehabilitation center's property. What had once been an unused acre of land was now the Gracie Sanctuary, a spacious, naturalistic enclosure designed specifically for a bobcat that walked the line between wild and tame. The decision to keep Gracie as a permanent resident hadn't been easy. The board had questions, funding had to be secured, and Tom himself had wrestled with whether it truly served Gracie's best interests. In the end, the evidence of her unique situation proved compelling. Her physical limitations and unusual relationship with humans made release problematic, while her obvious intelligence and adaptability suggested she could thrive in the right captive environment. "What do you think?" Tom asked Jenny as they made final inspections before moving day. The habitat featured multiple denning options, a flowing water feature, varied terrain from rocky outcrops to wooded areas, and carefully designed enrichment stations that could be regularly changed to prevent boredom. High platforms allowed Gracie to retreat from view when school groups or other visitors came to learn about bobcat conservation, while remote cameras would let them monitor her health and behavior with minimal intrusion. "It's spectacular," Jenny admitted. "Better than most zoo exhibits I've seen." She smiled slightly. "I still think you're crazy, but I can't deny she's special." "She chose to stay," Tom said simply. "I'm just honoring that choice." The transition to the new habitat went more smoothly than anyone expected. Gracie explored cautiously at first, but within days was utilizing every feature of the space, showing particular fondness for a sun-warmed rock ledge that overlooked the rehabilitation center. In the year that followed, Gracie became something of a local celebrity. The center developed an educational program around her story, teaching visitors about bobcat conservation, the dangers of habitat fragmentation, and the importance of wildlife corridors. School groups, conservation organizations, and wildlife photographers came to learn and observe, though access was carefully controlled to ensure Gracie's well-being remained the priority. Tom maintained his special connection with her, visiting regularly, though less frequently as she settled into her new life. She would often appear when she heard his voice, watching from a comfortable distance or sometimes approaching the perimeter of the habitat nearest to where he stood. "I think she's actually happy," Jenny remarked one autumn afternoon as they watched Gracie playfully batting at falling leaves. "As much as a wild animal can be happy in captivity." "She's found her balance," Tom agreed. "Not fully wild anymore, but never truly tame either." On the anniversary of her rescue, exactly 2 years since that snowy day when Mike the hiker had found her barely alive by the roadside, Tom brought his lunch to a bench near her habitat. It had become a tradition, this annual commemoration of the day their paths had crossed. To his surprise, Gracie emerged from her favorite hiding spot and approached the habitat edge nearest his bench. She settled down, mirroring his position on the other side of the barrier, and began grooming herself nonchalantly. Tom smiled. "Happy anniversary, Gracie." As if in acknowledgement, she looked up briefly, meeting his gaze with clear, confident eyes so different from the terror-filled ones he'd first encountered. Then she returned to her grooming, comfortable in his presence but wholly her own being. In that moment, Tom understood what had drawn him so powerfully to this particular animal from the beginning. It wasn't just her vulnerability or her fighting spirit, though both had moved him deeply. It was the reminder she provided of something essential about healing, that sometimes the most powerful thing one being can offer another is simply presence. Not domination or intrusion, not even active intervention beyond what's absolutely necessary, but steady, patient companionship that respects boundaries while refusing to abandon. The sun began to set over the Bridger Mountains, casting long shadows across Gracie's sanctuary. Tom finished his lunch in companionable silence with the bobcat who had changed the course of his life, as surely as he had changed hers. Later that evening, he added a final note to Gracie's file, which had grown thick with medical records, behavior observations, and habitat specifications over the past 2 years. Gracie continues to thrive in sanctuary conditions. Physical health excellent despite permanent partial disability in right hind leg. Mental well-being evidenced by natural behaviors, appropriate responses to enrichment, and what can only be described as contentment. She remains a daily reminder that healing is rarely linear, that trust must be earned rather than demanded, and that sometimes the gentlest approach is also the most transformative. This case has fundamentally altered my understanding of the rehabilitation process and the potential for connection across species boundaries. He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added one final line. In saving her, I somehow saved a part of myself I hadn't realized was lost. 5 years later, the Bridger Mountain Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had expanded significantly. Tom, now the director of a staff of 8, had leveraged Gracie's story to secure funding for additional rehabilitation facilities, research projects, and community education programs. Gracie, now a mature bobcat at approximately 7 years old, had settled into her role as the heart of the center. Her enclosure had been expanded twice more, and a dedicated team ensured she received appropriate stimulation and the optimal balance of privacy and interaction. On a warm June evening, Tom sat on his customary bench near her habitat, reviewing files for the day's new arrivals. A great horned owl with a wing injury and 2 orphaned fox kits. The work never slowed, the need never diminished, but his purpose had never been clearer. A soft rustling sound drew his attention. Gracie had appeared at her favorite observation point, her golden eyes watchful and wise. Though her fur now showed the occasional silver hair around her muzzle, she remained as beautiful and dignified as ever. Just another day at the office, Gracie, he told her with a smile. As always, she regarded him with that peculiar mixture of wild independence and comfortable recognition that defined their unusual friendship. Neither fully wild nor truly tame, she existed in a unique space between worlds, a living bridge between the realm of humans and the natural world they too often failed to understand or protect. In that space, on that bridge, both had found something irreplaceable, a connection that transcended words, that required no domestication or dominance, that honored the essential nature of each while acknowledging the profound impact they had on one another. Tom gathered his files and stood to leave. "See you tomorrow," he said. As he walked away, Gracie stretched luxuriously on a rock ledge, secure in her sanctuary, at peace with her unlikely life. Behind her, the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched her watchful eyes. Eyes that had once known only fear, but now held the quiet confidence of a spirit that had been broken but was never defeated. In the gentle evening light, wild and human existed in perfect balance, each forever changed by the simplest of acts. The decision to stay, to be present, to trust that healing would come in its own time and in its own way. And in that balance, both had found something like grace. Behind a crumbling barn in rural Texas, authorities made a heartbreaking discovery. A young bobcat who had spent years trapped in a backyard poacher's cage. Paralyzed by fear, she huddled in the darkest corners and trembled at the faintest hint of a human presence. When rescuers finally arrived, she pressed herself into the corner, as if the battered walls were the only things keeping her from falling apart. When she was brought to a wildlife sanctuary, she was physically safe but psychologically shattered. For days she faced the wall, refusing food, refusing every overture. Her tiny body quaking with a terror so profound it seemed ready to extinguish her spirit entirely. The expert caretakers were at a loss. But then, an unexpected visitor arrives. The woman sees the broken creature huddled in the corner and decides to try something no one else has. Could that quiet act of kindness reach a wild animal lost in the depths of despair? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The August heat in West Texas was merciless, bearing down on the ramshackle property like a physical weight. Hidden behind a dilapidated barn, rows of makeshift cages held creatures that should have been roaming free. A coyote with a mangled paw, several desert tortoises stacked atop one another, And in the darkest corner, a young bobcat pressed so tightly against the cage wall that she seemed to be trying to disappear into the rusted metal itself. Serafina, though she wouldn't receive that name until much later, had known nothing but this cage for the past 2 years. The poacher who'd trapped her as a kitten had dreams of selling exotic pets to wealthy collectors. But those dreams had withered like everything else in this forgotten corner of Texas. What remained was neglect, fear, and a young bobcat who trembled at every footstep, every shadow, every sound that might herald another day of torment. When the anonymous tip came to the wildlife authorities, Officer Jake Martinez had seen plenty of illegal animal operations, but this one made his stomach turn. The animals were malnourished, dehydrated, and psychologically broken. The bobcat was the worst of all. She wouldn't even turn to look at them, just pressed her face into the corner, her entire body vibrating with terror. "Jesus," Martinez whispered to his partner. "How long do you think she's been like this?" They'd never know the full story, but the evidence painted a grim picture. Scars on her legs suggested failed escape attempts. Her fur was patchy and dull, signs of chronic stress. When they finally managed to transfer her to a transport crate, a process that required sedation because she fought with the desperate strength of pure panic, she immediately wedged herself into the corner again, as if the walls were the only things keeping her from dissolving entirely. The Second Chance Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat on 50 acres of Texas hill country, far from the bobcat's desert origins, but infinitely better than where she'd been. Director Margaret Hollis had been rehabilitating wildlife for 30 years, but when she saw the bobcat arrive, even she was taken aback. "Put her in enclosure 7, she instructed the staff. "The quiet one, away from the other animals. And nobody goes near her unless absolutely necessary. This one's going to take time." For 3 days, Serafina, now officially named by the staff, didn't move from her corner. Food placed near the enclosure entrance went untouched. Water bowls remained full. She faced the wall as if it held all the answers to questions she couldn't voice, her spotted coat rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. "She's shutting down," veterinarian Dr. Robert Jim observed during a careful examination through the enclosure bars. "Classic trauma response. If we can't get her to eat soon, we'll have to intervene medically." That's when Emma Parker arrived. Emma wasn't supposed to be there that day. A wildlife photographer by trade, she'd come to document the center's successful release of rehabilitated hawks. But as she walked past the enclosures with her camera, she stopped short at enclosure 7. Through the chain link, she saw the bobcat, just a huddled form in the corner, so still she might have been mistaken for a pile of fur if not for the occasional shudder that ran through her body. "What's her story?" Emma asked Margaret, who'd been showing her around. Margaret sighed, explaining Serafina's background and current state. "We've tried everything. Different staff members, different approaches. She won't respond to anyone. It's been 5 days now since she arrived, and she's barely eaten anything." Emma set down her camera bag. "Can I try?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You're not trained in—" "I know," Emma interrupted gently, "but I've spent years photographing wild animals. I know how to be still, how to not be a threat. Maybe that's what she needs right now." After some consideration and a waiver signing, Margaret agreed to let Emma try, with strict supervision. Emma's approach was unlike anything the staff had attempted. She didn't try to coax or call to Serafina. She didn't rattle food bowls or make encouraging sounds. Instead, she simply sat down on the concrete floor outside the enclosure, about 6 feet from where Serafina huddled. She brought a book, an old paperback novel, and began to read silently. For 2 hours, she sat there. Serafina didn't move. Emma turned pages, shifted occasionally to ease her stiffening legs, but otherwise remained a quiet, non-threatening presence. When she left that first day, nothing had visibly changed. But Emma came back the next morning and did the same thing. On the third day, something shifted. As Emma settled into her now familiar spot, she noticed Serafina's ear, just the tip of one tufted ear, swivel slightly in her direction. It was barely perceptible, but Emma's photographer's eye caught it. Progress. She began to speak then, very softly, not to Serafina, but simply allowing her voice to exist in the space. She read aloud from her book, her tone low and steady, like a river over stones. The summer had been long and golden, stretching endlessly across the prairie. Serafina's other ear moved. By the end of the first week, Serafina had shifted her position slightly. She still faced the wall, but her body had relaxed from its rigid curl. Emma celebrated this tiny victory privately, understanding that pushing too hard now could undo everything. Margaret watched from her office window, amazed. "I've never seen anything like it," she told Dr. Jim. "She's not doing anything special, just being there." "Sometimes that's what trauma needs," Jim replied. "A presence that demands nothing." On day 10, Emma tried something new. She brought a small piece of cooked chicken. Serafina hadn't been eating the raw meat they'd been leaving, and placed it halfway between the enclosure entrance and Serafina's corner. Then she retreated to her usual spot and resumed reading. For an hour, nothing happened. Then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Serafina began to uncurl. Her head lifted slightly from the corner, though she didn't turn around. Emma kept her eyes on her book, though every fiber of her being wanted to watch. A rustling sound. Emma glanced up to see Serafina had turned. Not fully, but enough to eye the chicken with one amber eye. The bobcat's face was beautiful despite her condition. Distinctive black markings framing alert, intelligent features. But it was the fear in that eye that struck Emma most forcefully. Raw, primal fear that spoke of betrayals too numerous to count. Emma looked back at her book. "You take your time," she murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." 20 minutes later, Serafina moved. It wasn't a walk so much as a liquid slide along the wall, keeping as far from Emma as possible. She snatched the chicken and retreated, but not all the way to her corner. She stopped midway, eyeing Emma while she ate. It was the first voluntary meal she'd taken since arriving. The next day, Emma placed the food a little closer to her sitting spot. Serafina took longer to approach, but eventually, hunger won. Day by day, inch by inch, the food moved closer, and Serafina followed. 2 weeks into their routine, Emma had her first real interaction with Serafina. The bobcat had just taken a piece of chicken from barely 2 feet away when Emma slowly extended her hand, not reaching for Serafina, just letting it rest on the ground between them, palm up. Serafina froze, the chicken still in her mouth. Her pupils dilated, and for a moment, Emma thought she would bolt. But curiosity, that feline trait that no amount of trauma could fully extinguish, won out. Serafina stretched her neck forward, whiskers twitching as she investigated this new element. Her nose touched Emma's fingertip for just an instant before she pulled back. But she didn't run. She finished her chicken while watching Emma's hand, as if puzzling out what it meant. "That's a good girl," Emma whispered. "See? Not all hands hurt. Margaret had given Emma a key to come and go as she pleased by this point, recognizing that whatever magic was happening shouldn't be disrupted. Emma began spending entire days at the center, always with Serafina, but also helping with other tasks, learning more about rehabilitation. 3 weeks in, Serafina did something that made Emma's heart skip. After taking her food, instead of retreating, she sat down. Not close, still a good 4 feet away, but she sat facing Emma for the first time. Emma got her first real look at Serafina in full. Despite her ordeal, she was stunning. Her coat, though dull from stress, showed the beautiful spotted pattern that helped bobcats blend into their environment. Her paws seemed too large for her body, suggesting she was still young, maybe 3 years old at most. But it was her eyes that held Emma. Amber gold with that distinctive wildcat intensity. But behind the wildness was something else. A question, maybe. Or a tentative hope. They sat like that for an hour, just existing in the same space. When Emma finally stood to leave, Serafina didn't retreat to her corner. She stayed where she was, watching. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked morning in early September. Emma arrived to find Serafina not in her corner, but sitting by the enclosure entrance. When Emma approached, Serafina didn't move away. Emma sat in her usual spot, now protected from the rain by an overhang Margaret had installed specifically for these sessions. "Rough weather, huh?" Emma said conversationally. Serafina's ears swiveled at her voice, a response that had become common. Emma pulled out the day's offering. Chicken, as always, but also something new. A small ball with a bell inside, a toy designed for domestic cats but sized appropriately for a bobcat. She rolled it gently toward Serafina, who regarded it with deep suspicion. The bell tinkled softly as it came to rest near her paws. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, tentatively, Serafina reached out one paw and touched it. The bell rang again and she pulled back. But not in fear, in interest. Over the next few minutes, Serafina began to bat at the ball, her movements becoming more confident. It was the first time Emma had seen her act like what she was, a young cat, despite everything she'd endured. "There you are," Emma whispered. "There's still a bit of play in you." As if suddenly remembering herself, Serafina stopped and looked at Emma. Then she did something extraordinary. She picked up the ball in her mouth and took a step toward Emma. Just one step, but it was voluntary, purposeful. She dropped the ball and retreated, but the message was clear. She was choosing to engage. Emma rolled the ball back. This time, Serafina's response was quicker. Back and forth they went, a simple game that meant everything. When the chicken came out, Serafina took it from Emma's hand for the first time, her rough tongue briefly touching Emma's palm. The sensation sent shivers through Emma. Not fear, but awe. This was a wild animal choosing trust over instinct, hope over experience. As the weeks turned into a month, their relationship deepened. Serafina began to anticipate Emma's arrival, often waiting by the entrance. She became playful, batting at sticks Emma brought, even attempting a few pounces that showed her predatory instincts remained intact despite her captivity. But the real breakthrough came on a cool October morning. Emma was sitting closer to Serafina than ever before. Barely a foot separated them. She was reading aloud as had become their custom when she felt a weight against her shoulder. Serafina had leaned against her. Emma's breath caught. She didn't move, didn't react, just kept reading as if this was perfectly normal. Serafina's weight increased as she relaxed, and then Emma felt something she would never forget. The rumble of a purr. Not like a house cat's purr, but deeper, wilder, vibrating through Emma's entire body. Slowly, carefully, Emma raised her hand and placed it on Serafina's head. The bobcat didn't flinch. Emma began to stroke gently, feeling the soft fur, the solid muscle beneath. Serafina's purr intensified. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, until Emma's legs were completely numb and her back ached. She wouldn't have moved for anything in the world. When Margaret found them later, she stopped in her tracks. "My God," she breathed. "Emma, do you realize what you've done?" But Emma's mind was already moving to the next challenge. "She can't stay in captivity forever," she said, her hand still resting on Serafina's sleeping form. "She needs to be wild again." The debate was intense. Dr. Jim worried about Serafina's ability to survive after years in captivity. Margaret pointed out that she'd never learned to hunt properly. But Emma was adamant, and she had an ally in Jake Martinez, the officer who'd rescued Serafina. "That animal deserves a chance at real freedom," he said during a planning meeting. "If anyone can prepare her, it's Emma." So began Phase 2 of Serafina's rehabilitation. The center had a large enclosed area designed for pre-release conditioning, and Serafina was moved there. Emma's role shifted from companion to teacher. She started simple. Dead prey hidden around the enclosure forced Serafina to use her nose and hunting instincts to find food. At first, Serafina seemed confused by the game, looking to Emma for the usual handout. But Emma remained firm, encouraging her to search. The moment Serafina found her first hidden meal, her entire demeanor changed. Ancestral memories seemed to awaken as she crouched, stalked, and pounced on the already dead prey. Emma watched with pride and a growing sadness, knowing each successful hunt took Serafina closer to leaving. Live prey came next, mice and rats in controlled settings. Serafina's initial attempts were clumsy, her timing off after years of disuse. But she learned quickly, her natural instincts sharpening with each success. Emma celebrated every caught mouse, even as her heart grew heavier. They practiced for 2 months. Serafina grew stronger, more confident. Her coat gleamed with health, and her movements took on the fluid grace of a predator. She still came to Emma, still purred when they sat together. But something had changed. The wild was calling her home. The release site was carefully chosen, a remote area of Big Bend National Park with a healthy prey population and no resident bobcats to challenge a newcomer. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department approved the plan, and Serafina was fitted with a GPS collar for monitoring. The December morning of release was cold and clear. Emma rode in the transport vehicle with Serafina, her hand resting on the crate where the bobcat waited. She could feel Serafina's tension, but it was different from the terror of months ago. This was anticipation. At the release site, Emma helped position the crate facing the open desert. The landscape stretched endlessly. Creosote bushes, rocky outcroppings, and distant mountains painted purple in the morning light. Bobcat country. "You ready, girl?" Emma whispered. Margaret stood back with the rest of the team, giving Emma space for this final moment. Emma knelt by the crate door, her hand on the latch. "I want you to know something," she said, her voice thick. "You taught me as much as I taught you. About trust, about healing, about second chances." She wiped away a tear. Now go show this desert what you're made of." She pulled the latch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Serafina emerged, not rushing, not fearful, but stepping out with careful purpose. She paused at the crate entrance, her amber eyes surveying this new world. The morning sun caught her coat, turning it to burnished gold. She took a step, then another. 20 feet from the crate, she stopped and turned back. Emma met her gaze, trying to memorize every detail: the tufted ears, the distinctive markings, the intelligence in those wild eyes. Serafina held the look for a long moment. Then she gave what Emma could only describe as a nod, a deliberate dip of her head, before turning back to the desert. She didn't run. She walked with measured steps, her tail held high until the landscape swallowed her spotted form. Emma stayed on her knees long after Serafina disappeared, tears streaming freely now. Margaret's hand settled on her shoulder. "You did it," Margaret said softly. "You gave her back her life." The GPS data over the following months told a story of success. Serafina established a territory, hunted successfully, and avoided human contact. She was thriving. The collar was designed to fall off after a year, ensuring she'd eventually be truly free of all human interference. Emma returned to her photography, but she was changed. She began specializing in wildlife rehabilitation stories, using her lens to show the world that broken creatures could heal, that trust could be rebuilt, that wildness could be restored. She never saw Serafina again, though she visited Big Bend often, always hoping. But she carried something better than a sighting: the memory of a terrified bobcat who chose to trust, who learned to play again, who reclaimed her birthright of freedom. Sometimes, on quiet nights when Emma reviewed her photographs, she would come across the few she'd taken during Serafina's rehabilitation. Her favorite showed Serafina mid-pounce during hunting practice, all 4 feet off the ground, joy evident in every line of her body. That was how Emma chose to remember her. Not as the terrified creature pressed against a cage wall, but as she was meant to be. Wild, free, magnificent. And sometimes, when the desert wind carried the sound of a bobcat's call across the Texas night, Emma would smile and whisper, "I hear you, girl. I hear you." The Rehabilitation Center used Serafina's story in their fundraising efforts, helping save dozens more animals. Her successful release became a model for treating severely traumatized wildlife. But for Emma, Serafina would always be more than a success story. She was proof that patience could heal what force could not touch. That trust, once shattered, could be rebuilt one quiet moment at a time. That sometimes the greatest gift we can give another living being is simply to sit with them in their fear until they're ready to step into the light. And in the vast wilderness of Big Bend, a bobcat with amber eyes and a spotted coat lived as her ancestors had, carrying within her the memory of a woman who taught her that not all human hands bring pain. Some bring the way home,